Ambassador Legon is one of the country's foremost authorities on human trafficking. He's the former executive director and CEO of the leading anti-human trafficking nonprofit, the Polaris Project, and from 2007 to 2009 as U.S. Ambassador at Large in the State Department, Ambassador Legon directed the office to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. He's also a founding board member of the Global Business Coalition Against Human Trafficking and serves on the advisory board of End Child Prostitution and Trafficking. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Organization Affairs at the U.S. Department of State with responsibility for UN-related human rights and humanitarian issues. He was also a member of the Secretary of State Colin Powell's policy planning staff. He's currently professor in the practice of international affairs and global politics relations and security chair at Georgetown and the adjunct senior fellow for human rights at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's co-editor of the forthcoming book, Human Dignity and the Future of Global Institutions. Please welcome Mark Legon.
Well, it's a pleasure to be introduced by Lisa, and it's always great to work with her. This issue of human trafficking is a very suitable one to be brought up at this summit, since Human Rights First is so committed to a partnership model for dealing with horrendous human rights problems, and this one involving gender, involving migrants who are stepped on, and ways that business can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Human trafficking, just to say a word on what it is not really about moving people across borders primarily. It's about extreme exploitation. And it's really modern-day slavery, and whether it is the prostituted child, the documented construction worker in the Gulf, or the undocumented fruit picker in the United States, these are people who are robbed of their autonomy and oftentimes treated like they're criminals or someone to deport or just disposable. So it's a special pleasure to be here with two leading figures who can look at different aspects of human trafficking and especially how we can work together to try and eliminate this horrible form of exploitation. On my left and your right is Letty Ashworth. She's General Manager for Global Diversity at Delta Airlines. She works closely with all of her company's business units trying to recruit diverse talent, and she has oversight of a number of employee networks, African American, women's, Asia Pacific, gay and lesbian and Hispanic groups in the company. She's involved in a number of global good projects for the company, but with me, a board member of the Global Business Coalition Against Human Trafficking. Cindy McCain, you know. She's devoted her life to trying to improve the lives of those who are less fortunate, like many in this room. She's chair of her family's business, Hensley & Company, which is one of the largest Anheuser-Busch distributors in the nation. She speaks here in large part as co-chair of the Arizona Governor's Task Force on Human Trafficking. That is one of a number of important issues at home and abroad she's worked on for social good, being a founding member of the Eastern Congo Initiative, on the board of trustees of the Halo Trust, a nonprofit that's committed to landmine removal and other great efforts. I'd ask first for Letty to offer some remarks, and then, first Cindy McCain to offer some remarks on the domestic front, and then we'll turn to Letty. My apologies.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for being here. Most importantly, you all are on the front line of all of this, and those of us that toil away in our own home states or in our own businesses, it has been a challenge. I began this with an experience for me, and it was something that this is some years back actually, and I was in India. I was shopping for a sari. We have a daughter from Bangladesh. I was bringing a gift back to her. And while I was talking to the gentleman that owned the little shop, I heard this fluttering underneath the floor, just busyness underneath the floorboards of the shop. And I finally asked him, I said, what's going on down there? What's happening? Is there a party? What is it? And he said, no, it's just my family. Well, we continued to shop, and I looked, eventually the slats were big enough where I could kind of look through the floorboard, and I could see all these little eyes looking up at me. And it dawned on me that this man was housing and probably shuttling children around the country and maybe even around the world. But the problem with that was, obviously, the obvious problem was the children were under the floorboards, but the real problem for me is that I walked out of there and didn't do anything. I never did anything at that time, and it's haunted me ever since. So I sit here today before you, co-chairing the Governor's Task Force on Human Trafficking for the state of Arizona. And we are a state that had not dealt with this problem at all. In fact, if you would talk to our state legislators, they really didn't believe it existed. Certainly not in Arizona, and never in our neighborhoods. And most of all, didn't think we needed any legislation that could actually strengthen what we had on the books, and more importantly, compound that with making sure that these pimps know that Arizona will be a flyover state. It has been an interesting year and a half, 2 years, just working on this for me, because we are the next hosts after New Jersey of the Super Bowl. And you know what happens with large events like that. It brings in the worst of the worst, as well as all the revelers that enjoy the game itself. So for Arizona and what we're doing there, our plan is our legislative session begins in January. We're looking forward to stuff being passed because our governor is actually drafting the legislation now. And more importantly, we're looking forward to then being able to take what we have learned and what we hope other states will adopt up through the Western corridor that does not include California, Washington, or Oregon. It is just the Western corridor because we are what's lacking in the country with regards to anything substantive, defending the victims of human trafficking. So I look forward to working with all of you, most importantly, because you guys are the ones that really know what's going on both domestically and worldwide. And more importantly, I look forward to watching this country learn what human trafficking is, learn that there is a problem domestically within our own borders, and more importantly, figure out that we can do something about it. And most importantly, redrafting the language. These people are not prostitutes. They are victims. They are, and most of all, not only are they victims, but they need to be treated as such and need to be given the services that we can then enable them to become full and whole human beings again. So it all sounds very lofty, but it's a huge task, and I know all of you know that and understand that. But I really want to thank all of you for being here, because we need people like you, and we need people like you, not only just here in Washington, D.C., but venture out west and tell us what we're doing wrong, because we'd like to hear. Thank you.
That's great. Food for thought for our dialogue we'll have. Letty, from the perspective of Delta.
Well, good afternoon, and I too thank you for being a part of this very important dialogue on human trafficking, and certainly thank you to Mark, my, I say co-conspirator with GBCAT, in that we've made it part of our life mission also to combat this terrible pandemic. And I would be remiss if I didn't start out by saying that Richard Anderson, the CEO of Delta Airlines, is an amazing CEO, in that Delta still remains one of the first and major airlines in the country to take up this cause. A little bit about the journey of Delta Airlines, and I would I think that a lot of forums that you've attended in the past have a combined voice that involves NGOs, involves government entities, as well as some business content. But one of the things that we thought to be important at Delta Airlines in terms of taking a leading role was to step out front early, get ahead of this subject. So back in 2010, when some of the conversation just started to surface from this, well, what is, to your point, what is human trafficking? What does that mean? When we've looked at the numbers, I think depending on upon the survey, you'll hear numbers like 27 million trafficked, you'll hear 20 million trafficked, 2.5 million people in forced labor. And we don't talk about what's going on our own borders. Approximately 100,000 children, American children, are trafficked annually. And so as part of Delta's initiative early on, we adopted the ECPAT code, which is the End Child Prostitution Against Human Trafficking. We signed on to the 6 tenets of the code. I am happy to say, and without going through, and I'll share more as we move along, that we have, in fact, in the past 2 years, not only adopted a human rights policy, we also have in place a supplier code of conduct that has explicit language, specific language to the repudiation of child sex activity. And we make that applicable to our vendors and all of our suppliers. One of the tenets of the code also says that you are to train your employees. And that has been, I would say, part of my job. No, I'll say it's all of my job for the last 2 years. So we have been working with the Department of Transportation, Homeland Security, and we've partnered with them on their Blue Lightning training. And over the last year and a half, we've been working diligently. We worked through modules not only for our general population, but for our supply chain. And I'm happy to say that since September 9th of 2013 through yesterday at 8 a.m., we have trained 47,000 of our employees worldwide.
Ooh, yay.
Very exciting news. And our goal certainly by the end of 2014 is to complete that number, and then we will move into our supply chain, deeper into the supply chain. And so we're doing some really good things, and we're glad to be out front, and we'll continue in this fight.
That's great. Appreciate it. Well, I wanted to offer some thoughts, having headed the State Department Office on Human Trafficking and a leading nonprofit, Polaris Project, more on the international context. And when I headed the State Department Office for a couple of years, the bulk of focus had been on sex trafficking, and I'm deeply concerned about sex trafficking, including of minors. But a lot of the victims are victimized for purposes of labor. The ILO, in studying this in a study they came out with in the summer of 2012, found that while 55% of the victims are female, many of those are exploited for labor as well as for sexual exploitation, that 3/4 of the victims of human trafficking globally are in fact primarily exploited for labor rather than sex. And I tried to make the contribution when I was the ambassador to combat human trafficking that we look at both of these problems. And I think it would be an equally bad mistake for us to say, oh, those issues of sex trafficking are too sticky, it's too complicated to know whether it's a choice or exploitation. We need to focus on those too. How are we doing in the world on fighting this problem? I think we're doing better on paper, on laws and treaties on paper, than we are in implementation. Some 2/3 of the countries in the world have passed laws completely banning all forms of human trafficking, not just one form like child labor. And 3/4 of the countries in the world have ratified the UN's treaty on this, the Palermo Protocol. And yet, if you look at the very admirable State Department Global Report on human trafficking, the numbers of prosecutions are low. They're especially low in the area of labor exploitation. Only 15% of the prosecutions globally related to human trafficking are for exploitation for labor. And while we think there are at least 20 million victims in the world, only about 40 or 45,000 victims were found last year. What we need is partnerships. And I again emphasize that this is a very fitting thing for Human Rights First to talk about. In so many ways, whether it's calling upon businesses to do the right thing on human rights, but talking with them and partnering with business to fight human rights problems, or challenging the U.S. government to explain why it's pursued a policy on detainees, but also engaging in dialogue to try and fix the problem. Partnership as a model is crucial here. This is something that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton emphasized. But how do you more effectively bring together governments, international organizations, nonprofits, and businesses? There are lots of good examples, whether on the home front, the state's attorney's office working with the Salvation Army in Cook County, Illinois, to try and find those people who are domestic minors who are sex trafficking victims, or wonderful partner of Human Rights First International Justice Mission that has worked with law enforcement in the Philippines to try and train police to spot the problem. And now the number of minors in the sex industry have dropped by some 80% in the last 4 years. Business has a special role to play. They've gotten burned. One thinks of the example of the Gap that had some 60 inspectors of supply chains for its various suppliers and found that little girls were involved in brutal human trafficking circumstances in India, embroidering blouses for export to the West. That means that there is a need for businesses to worry about their vulnerability to what they have in their supply chains and to bad press, but much more, I think they need to see that the communities that they work with in their supply chains will be so much more productive if they made sure that there wasn't brutal exploitation. I think it's great that businesses like Delta have partnered with Microsoft and Coca-Cola and others to form a coalition on human trafficking. They need to work with government. Government is oftentimes seen as the first player to make a difference on a problem, including human trafficking. Business is a vital partner. But I will leave you with a couple of thoughts about something this good government should do. I'm a big advocate of the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. It's my own personal opinion. But the idea that businesses should publish what they're doing to check out their supply chains for where forced labor and human trafficking might be caused is a really good idea. It doesn't mandate to businesses in a very intrusive way what they must do, but it, through transparency, incentivizes businesses to look into their supply chains because they're required to tell their consumers, the public, what they're doing. And I think we should pursue something like that, as Senator Rubio and Congresswoman Maloney have been interested in doing on the national level. So anyway, I hope we can open things up now and look at your questions for us on the domestic front and the international front, how we can better partner and move the needle to move beyond laws and treaties on paper that are very commendable, but oftentimes the victims of human trafficking are denied access to justice. Any questions? Please identify yourself when you ask a question.
I'm Marianne Stein. I'm Marianne Stein. I guess I'm on the Board of Advocates of Human Rights First. And I'm the president of the Mariah Fund and the founding chair of the Fund for Global Human Rights. Also the landlord of International Labor Rights Forum. And it's really, to some degree, because of the latter that I'm asking this question. One of the issues, certainly in terms of labor issues and where there is exploitation and trafficking, that I would consider also a labor issue. The voices of the workers are really not heard. Their participation in deciding about what the problems are and the remedies aren't heard. And I think that this is also true with respect to the trafficking, not necessarily that you're going to form a union of trafficked people. But if workers in these companies are involved in some of the decision-making and the implementation and the monitoring, it would seem to me that this would also improve the detection and the corrective actions that need to be taken. And I'd be very interested in your thoughts on this point, whether there is a role for labor to play and whether that shouldn't be part of some of the sourcing rules
as companies look down their supply chains to see who's having input into making the decisions that relate to this issue.
Do either of you want to say something on that score? Okay. Well, I think it's true. We need to think about the labor situation. On my very first trip when I headed the State Department office, I went to Southeast Asia. I went to Thailand in particular, and it was a labor rights group that took me out to Samut Sakhon to see where people who were involved in the seafood processing industry, in particular shrimp peeling, had been subjected to brutal forced labor. And there's a larger context of those who are a voice for labor rights in general. I mean, you have a situation here where there's an enabling environment. You know, prostitution is not the same as sex trafficking, but it's a realm in which sex trafficking arises. If there weren't, you know, lots of men buying commercial sex, there wouldn't be this hazardous situation. And while globalization does not mean that it's inevitably the case that we're going to get slavery, labor rights in a situation of globalization is very, very important. And so I agree with you and my friends at the Solidarity Center that this is part of the picture. If you were to have a multi-stakeholder partnership to figure out how groups of people who are left out from access to justice are going to be treated like human beings in full, workers should be at the table.
If I can say, you know, Arizona faces this issue particularly in the summer because so many of these folks that are being trafficked for labor purposes die coming over the border. They never make it alive to Tucson or to Phoenix. It becomes a little more basic, though, and the issue that we have out west and the fight that we have as people that are obviously in support of stopping human trafficking is the language. Because most people along the southern border, rightly or wrongly, and I don't agree with this, view this as an immigration problem. Mm-hmm. And so we are now, within our small bit of legislation we're working on right now, trying to address that so that this is not an immigration issue. This is a human rights issue. But changing the language and changing the understanding by the legislators both in Arizona, New Mexico, California, and Texas is a whole different deal on this. So any suggestions anyone has on this, I'd love to know. But that's what we're fighting with right now, and it's more basic than trying to get representation or legal services for any of these folks, because most of them die before they ever make it.
Cindy, it's a really good point. You know, I remember when I was a peon Hill staffer working on the original trafficking legislation at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Lamar Smith of Texas asked the question in the final legislation, aren't people going to game the system and when they want the humanitarian visa to stay in the United States as a human trafficking victim, aren't undocumented workers going to claim human trafficking victims? He asked for a ceiling on the number of the humanitarian visas. We've never come anywhere near close to that ceiling. Yeah. This is a situation of vulnerable people who need to be recognized for what they are. What other questions might you have? And feel free to direct the question to a particular member of the panel if you like.
Thank you so much. This has been a great panel. I'm Rebecca Posey. I'm from Atlanta. Go Delta. And I'm an anti-trafficking advocate with Not for Sale. I also consult on corporate social responsibility issues. And so my question is for Letty. Oh, and I also write for a millennial blog in Atlanta. I'd like to know, can you talk just a little bit more about how you rolled out your supplier code of conduct within Delta and how you went through this massive process of auditing your supply chain? And how did you sell that, especially to members of your board? I think it would be really valuable for all of us to hear how we can be effective when we're trying to explain the importance of this issue to corporate actors.
Good question.
Well, you know, I think it starts from the top, and that's why I started out by thanking Richard Anderson. We have a CEO who is progressive. He specifically stated that as a global and socially responsible airline, we owe it to our customers, we owe it to our shareholders, and we owe it to our employees to take the lead on this. As such, as you can imagine, our senior leaders were on board pretty quickly in this process. Now, I always include in these types of panels the notion that this is not an easy body of work for companies. I would also say that I would say that I believe that companies don't get involved because they are afraid of the unknown. And once you begin to get into this work, you get deeper in and there's more work to do and there's more work to do, as is the case with the supply chain. So let me back up to just the awareness. So there are two pieces, or probably two streams of work that I oversee. One is the awareness campaign, which involves the training. And then the supply chain is a much more involved process that's still evolving. In a matter of 12 months to come up with a supplier code of conduct with language and contracts. Since the supplier code of conduct was written, all of our contracts now contain specific language. So it was a pulling together of all of our internal resources, from our senior VPs down through our commodity managers, who are the ones who then oversee the work of our vendors. Certainly what we do now won't be what we're doing in 5 years. We will move further and further down the pipeline. But it is a tremendous amount of work. With the training, we started out, gosh, I think I said it was 2010, but in earnest, it took more than a year to put just the basic pieces in place to get everyone on board, when not everyone is. Let me be honest. Companies are saying, why are we dealing with this? There are so many additional issues that we should be concerned with, and profitability is one of them. Many are afraid that there is going to be a ding to their brand. And so you have to work through all those nuanced situations. And like Mark said, we were not only with ECPAT I mentioned, but we too were one of the founding members of the Global Business Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And I also work closely, as I mentioned, with the Department of Transportation, Homeland Security, with transportation leaders against human trafficking. And something that you and I, Cindy, talked about, one group in that group are truckers against human trafficking. And so how do we work together? How do we spread this conversation, whether it's government, NGOs, and specifically businesses, is that we've got to continue the dialogue, not shame and blame. Because that's a real reason why, as I talk to other companies, they're like, you know what, Letty, it's easier not to get involved. That way, you don't have to measure anything that I do. Well, we're encouraging them, get in the water with us. It's okay. And so we're here, along with the groups that I mentioned, GBCAT, to be that thought leader forum to help you work through those processes. So I hope that sort of answers it.
Please, sir.
Hi, Charlie Ottstadt. I'm an advocate for human rights. Could you explain a little bit about the training program that you've done? 47,000 people in 3 months is quite a record. Could you describe the depth and the breadth of that, whether they do it in small groups, individually, by TV media, or whatever?
Currently, it's in its LMS form, and it is monitored where we have our own internal training system. Now, interestingly enough, when we started the journey, we didn't know if we wanted to have a person in the room teaching, and we are moving toward that model as well. And by the end of 2014, the training will be a part of our annual recurrent training. So we're very happy that we're moving in that. But the current model is it's a video, and it's through our own internal LMS system. Now, that is a large number. And as most companies do when we are introducing a new subject matter, as soon as we announced that the training was available to take, it was the #1 trending subject for our company. We encouraged and mandated that our customer-facing employees, such as our in-flight employees, our ACS employees, which are above wing and below wing employees, would take the training. Now, having said that, part of the training is a hybrid of some of the security protocols that we already have in place, similar to the TSA, see something, say something. So if, for instance, we were cautious, we didn't move as quickly as I may sound, in that we wanted to make sure that we were not deputizing our employees to sort of body slam Mark if he's coming through the airport with a child that doesn't quite seem to fit with him. Or if I have my niece who's Korean, who doesn't quite look like me, raises suspicion. So we did some groundwork prior to the online process from an awareness perspective. And we're really still, I would say, in that place. Because as we move closer, or move more and more into the process, we're adding pieces to that. But it has been an amazing process in the last 60 days. It is still the #1 trending online training for our company right now. We are very pleased with those results.
So just tack on a couple things to what Letty said. The Manpower Corporation, another one of our partners in the Global Business Coalition, which its specialty is global labor work, found that employee satisfaction and retention by companies, saving them money, not pursuing recruiting new employees and training new employees, is increased when companies work on this issue. There may be something to people, running to that opportunity for training. What other questions might we have?
Can I say something that you just mentioned? You talked about deputizing people to go out and body slam folks. What we are faced with right now, or what I'm finding that we're going to be faced with in Arizona, is the influx of hundreds and hundreds of very well-meaning NGOs from across the country who do work on this subject on a daily basis, but descending on Arizona and then more or less kind of acting as vigilantes. Mm-hmm. And we are trying to figure out a way to welcome them, because we do. We want all the help we can get, but we also don't want anything to interfere with the law enforcement aspect of this, if that's what it comes down to. I'd love any suggestions with regards to just that. I'd like to see NGOs work together more, but I also would like to see them work together in a fashion, especially around a large event or a large happening, in a way that would be productive and not.
You're so right about two elements of this. The NGOs working with each other.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing about our friends at Humanity United, who are trying to get nonprofits who are working on this issue to collaborate. But also, it's the trust level. One of the key partnership problems here in the United States and around the world is law enforcement on the one hand, and nonprofits on the other, and they have some distrust of each other. Nonprofits can be really, really vital partners of law enforcement in finding the victims. If a victim is afraid that she or he is going to be treated as, at best, disposable, but maybe criminal or deportable, then it's very often the nonprofits that can help, but they need to work with law enforcement. Other questions, comments? Please.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Binta Brown. I'm on the board here and am studying the intersection of human rights and business as a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School this year. So first of all, I think that Delta is, and all of the other members of the consortium are absolutely to be applauded for the work that you're doing. There have been some studies, though, that have expressed skepticism about self-regulation by business in this regard. And there's a separate book which argues, I think pretty reasonably, and I can't remember the author's name. He was an academic out of Brown, I believe, out of MIT, who's now at Brown, who had a team, investigating supply chain issues, building, codes of conduct, all of these different things to see if they actually are generating results. and generating change. And disturbingly, what he found is that despite the best intentions of some of these businesses, that there really hasn't been a great deal of change. And so in the first instance, I'm wondering, what is your response to that, and what has been the thinking internally around that? And then in the second instance, with regards to the training that you're doing of your employees, how can you enforce that such that it does down the road generate real results?
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, when you talk about the policing aspect of it, one of the mandates of the ECPAC code is that we report out. And that's on an annual basis, and so that's part of my responsibility. And while we don't get necessarily into some of the confidential pieces, we are currently working with Department of Homeland Security to make sure that what we can share, we will share. I think this is so new. I don't know that even, or any company for that matter, has a real report card yet. I don't think we've gone through enough of, even with the training, the best intentions, I don't think we're going to see the results for 2 or 3 or more years out. I think we have to be vigilant in making sure that our internal processes, those commodity managers, are meeting with our suppliers. We are making sure that they are there's a compliance component in there. I know that we have planned managers that are going to oversee those processes as we get further into the supply chain. I don't know that we're going to see all of the results before the next year and a half. As part of our ongoing training, by 2014, it will be mandatory for all of our employees. We've also started to put it in our onboarding process so that any new employees that come into the company will be mandated to take the training. I will tell you, since our training started, we've had a number of incidents reported. I'm happy to say only one proved to be a real trafficking incident. So what does that say? It says that the word is out. Our employees feel empowered to make the call, escalate the situation, and we tell them it's okay to be wrong. We'd rather you be wrong 100% of the time, reporting it, than have one issue and you didn't say anything. And so we're okay with that. So I think we're still feeling our way through. And it is also why we believe, and we're planning some sessions next year in 2004. In fact, January 10th is we're hosting a session it's going to be a B2B, business-to-business conversation, because we need to talk about it in a safe environment and really work through some of these hard questions, because companies are afraid. Companies don't have the bandwidth. I mean, I can honestly say most companies are not going to hire a whole team of people to go out and work on this. There are no budgeted dollars per se. So it's got to come from somewhere. So I think we're still grappling with some of that. And I'm always open if there are recommendations, and it's what you're saying, that opportunity to work together and say, have you thought about this? In a non-threatening manner, of course.
Do you have anything you wanted to add? Any other questions? Over here? Is there Mike?
I just want to question the number. My name is Dan Newell. I'm a United States citizen. I'm employed, self-employed contractor. I just do some work to shed light on people that need light shed on them, and then put people in the shadow that don't need the light. My question is the number. 27 million sounds like a large number. How do you check the fact that the number increases or decreases every year? How do you do a survey of the number?
Great question. You want me to take this? Numbers are hard. If we're to have any sense of progress, you need to know what the baseline is. There was a very soft number that was developed by the International Labor Organization in 2005, and then they came up with a much better number using scholars around the world to verify their numbers in 2012, and they said they're at least 20.9. million victims of human trafficking, and the scholar Kevin Bales says that there's some 27. Needless to say, it's if people are in the shadows of the global economy being stepped on for sexual or labor exploitation, it is hard to count. But I do think our ability to make a difference does, require some better sense of the scale. But we do know some things. We know that 40% of the victims of human trafficking who are trafficked into the United States come from East Asia, and 40% of them come from Latin America. We have a good sense that there are 100,000 minors in the United States who are sex trafficking victims, and these are people who never cross borders. And I think we're increasingly getting a better sense of this, so we can get our arms around the problem.
I would also add, earlier this week, I was with Ernie Allen, who's the CEO of Missing and Exploited Children. And so, to that baseline data, I think it's organizations like that and others, I think, again, we'll have a better sense next year than we do now. But I think there's still quite a bit of significant documentation that currently exists. But stay tuned. I think you'll see us tighten those processes up.
When we are able to coordinate, you remember hearing the debate about frequencies, the first responders couldn't talk on the same frequencies and all this kind of stuff. There is some effort right now to be able to coordinate all frequencies on just this issue so that the first responder in Idaho can talk to the guy in Atlanta because there's something popped up on a screen and said this came from Atlanta, it could be a trafficking thing. He would be able to immediately talk to Atlanta and find out just what's going on and whether this could really be a trafficking issue. That's kind of where this is so new that it's very difficult to really get a real solid count. And I know we all deal in numbers because that's important to us. But I think the more that we can unite the country from a first responder level, from all the ways enabling people to have access to information that's indeed accurate and timely, will be. I mean, it's invaluable to this kind of an issue. But we're not there yet. We're working on it. Folks like Polaris Project and others are really giving it a push to help us with just that.
Yeah, and you're right to raise Polaris. It has a national hotline that it runs for the U.S. government, and it's been in existence long enough that now you can begin to see patterns of what people are exploited for, what kinds of things you see, and Google Ideas has stepped forward to work with Polaris Project to try and share some of that hotline model with other countries. More facts does help have less exploitation.
If I can add also, though, Google's a perfect point of contact here, if I may. Until we can make sure that Google doesn't glamorize this, and I'm not banging on Google, I'm just using that as kind of a generic effort here. But when you put in the word pimp on Google, you come up with guys that are dressed, oh my God, they've got furs and Cadillacs and everything else. They look glamorous. That's ridiculous. That's completely ridiculous. So I think there needs to be some social conscience in some of this. And I don't know how you do that. I know there's a First Amendment issue here and all that kind of stuff. So it's beyond my pay grade. But that has got to be dealt with because it's what these guys see and it's what other people see that glamorize something that is not glamorous. Yeah. It's deadly.
And we need to change minds. I mean,
yeah.
Just as there are people who, their demand for really cheap goods
yeah.
may lead to their being the cheapest labor and then the worst form of cheapest labor, which is enslaved labor, the demand for sex trafficking is not something to be glamorized or say, oh, men have always bought sex from females through the ages, we'll never change that. An example of this along the Google lines, MTV Exit was created to do videos and concerts throughout East Asia and South Asia to call attention to the human trafficking issue. But they used to have messaging something similar to, if you are a customer of commercial sex, make sure that the person you're with is not a sex trafficking victim. Well, maybe we ought to back up and
yeah.
say, don't be a customer of commercial sex. At the same time,
Doesn't pass
MTV
the
at the
smell
time,
test.
Yeah,
MTV was glorifying the image of a pimp
Yeah.
as hero. Now, things have evolved to the stage where MTV Exit is really, has spot-on messaging that really can help, change minds in the culture. Other questions? We have just a few minutes left.
A question here. My name is Gustavo Baloa. I work with refugees in Las Vegas. The issue of the human trafficking, as I'm from Las Vegas, where we have a casino and hotel. I want to touch a little bit about the financial lobby. The corruption is a very sensitive issue. Most of hotel and casino in Las Vegas, they use ladies in terms of sex trafficking, and they are not affected by the different challenges like the laws or the lobby, the advocacy, because they are financially rich. They have a lot of money. They hire powerful lawyers. And it's easy to see how important they are when it's come the time of the election. For example, they support senators, they support Congress people, they support everybody. And they are not affected because they are financially rich. And they are actually those who are using the survivor and the victim in their hotel and the casino, but they are peaceful, they are not affected. How your work can do to fight the rich people, the financial lobby who is doing the human trafficking but are not affected because of corruption. The level of corruption is so high that we can't understand. So the second question.
Maybe we could.
I finished my question. The second question is the sex work issue. As a human rights activist, I support the sex work as a profession, not in terms of human trafficking, but because we are against people being jobless, and the sex work can be a kind of profession if we legalize and get the legal aspect of it, so people, ladies who don't have jobs, can do their work and get in life.
This is a good point, and why don't we take those 2 points and respond to them?
I finished just 1 second, please.
We have only 5 minutes left, so
Okay.
we're gonna respond. Thank you for your 2 good ideas. Cindy.
First of all, no woman or little boy or man should ever have to think that selling themselves for sex is an option. This is what I should be doing. That whether you agree or disagree, they're having to sell their bodies. That's damn wrong. Now, with regard to the casinos and the efforts in Las Vegas, if you were talking about Las Vegas in particular, I disagree with what you said. I think the casinos have been very forthright up there. They have an attorney general that has come down really hard on them and is producing some legislation in Nevada that is going to be stellar among any legislation across the country. But with that said, you never mentioned the customer. The customer is who we need to deal with in this. It's wrong to want to service little children and buy children. It's wrong to make a woman have to sell herself to a man for profit in a hotel room in some weird state someplace. You have to address the overall concept of what this is. We're victimizing women and children. We are victimizing little boys, and we are victimizing people that can't help themselves. There are better ways, and that's why we have to get together and do this differently. It's wrong. I disagree with everything you said. It's wrong.
I don't know that I.
Sorry.
I don't want to add to that because it's a good place to end. But I will say corruption globally matters. It stands in the way of fighting human trafficking. In Brazil, they fined thousands of victims of human trafficking for forced labor, but very few get prosecuted, and that has a little something to do with corruption, and we should watch for powerful interests. But I agree in large part with Cindy McCain that the key here is to think about the buyer and putting people on sale. Think human trafficking, not trafficking moving some across the border, but the human trade. Someone being turned into purely a commodity. That's not just general labor in a situation of globalization. That's dehumanizing.
Exactly.
That's dehumanizing. Do you have any last thoughts either of you would like to share before we
Well, I
wrap
had
up?
lots of last thoughts, but well, I think we were just getting started here. It's a big body of work, and certainly wherever I am, you will see me standing at the forefront along with my colleagues here, through ECPAT. I think one of our colleagues is here, through GBCAT, our executive directors in the room as well. And Delta will continue in the fight from an awareness perspective, from an advocacy perspective, and we'll ensure, we'll to the best of our ability, continue in the fight and help lead the charge.
Listen, I appreciate being here, I really do, and I am very passionate about this. I think because I walked away from a situation, it has bothered me for the rest of my life. But what you all are doing, and your interest in being here, and your interest in the subject is most important. And that what you can do back in your own communities is essential to this. And so we look forward to working with all of you. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate you. And thank you for letting me vent. I appreciate it.
My last thought is that I just think it's great that the broader human rights community think about human trafficking. There's a way that people who work on issues get siloed out. There's a very vital human trafficking movement that's developing around the world, but it's great when the larger human rights community sees this is a central issue where women and children and migrants, people of disadvantaged castes, minorities are robbed of the chance to be treated like human beings in full, and it's a pleasure to work with you, and I hope we can do it in a active, collaborative way in the future. Thanks.